Welcome, everyone. And I wanted to say, as I'll say several times during the day, thank you to AXA, and thank you to the School of Earth Sciences at Bristol, and to the Cabot Institute, because everyone has made me feel very welcome here. And it's really a unique opportunity for me to be here. So when AXA suggested that I do a masterclass, I said, what's a masterclass? I think of that as what musicians do with advanced students. But then I realized that I could do whatever I wanted to do. And one thing that I have been interested in, and I will tell you a little bit why I'm interested in this, is the role that science and scientists can play at active volcanoes. And that's what I thought we'd focus on, and those of you who signed up for the class got copies of papers and were assigned papers. And so most of the master class, I'll actually have you in small groups talking to each other, and I'll come around and mix with you. But just to set the stage, what we're working on for the entire day is really this intersection. We have a number of groups of people who will be in the afternoon. I've focused on volcanology because I'm a volcanologist, but this is generally applicable to various natural hazards. And most of us in the room think of ourselves as scientists. However, if you haven't discovered this yet, you will soon, that if you're working in fields that affect people, you can't ignore the people part of things. And so during my career, which has stretched longer than I'd like to say, I've really seen a change in the perception of scientists about their role in society. And at the same time, there have been increased interfaces and recognition of the need to interface with policymakers, and for the purpose of this morning's class, particularly people who are faced with handling crises, volcanic crises, emergency management people. And obviously their focus is on how to manage risk, but one thing that's become very apparent over the last few decades, as people have worked on this more and more, is recognizing that just because you know the risk, what the risk is, and that's assuming that we know it, and that's one thing we're going to be talking about, that doesn't always mean that we can predict how people are going to behave in response to it. And that's really where I see social science coming in, where the social scientists focused on how people actually behave, both in the short term, but also I've been particularly interested in the long term and what anthropology and history can tell us. So I wanted to just give you a little bit of background on me. You'll see these slides again this afternoon because I figured this is important to introduce to you not just who I am, but how I got here. And my very first experience with volcanology was in a fairly unusual place. It was in Antarctica. I was down there in 1978 as part of a group of volcanologists working on the active volcano Mount Erebus, which has a lava lake. And so at least Steve at the back of the room there will recognize a few of these faces. This was a very famous French volcanologist, Haroun Tazieff, who was up there with us, a New Zealand seismologist, Ray Dibble, Phil Kyle, a volcanologist who has worked on Erebus now for 30 or 40 years, Werner Gegenbach, who was a very famous volcanic gas geochemist. And we were up there with a couple of climbing specialists, Colin Monteith and Harry Keyes, because our goal in this time was to go down into the crater of Mount Erebus. And Werner, shown here, wanted to get some samples of the gases. So we went down in the crater, and Mount Erebus erupts often a few times a day, and it erupted when Werner was down not on a rope in the inner crater, the rest of us were here, had bombs falling around us. It was very exciting. But that event not only introduced me to the concept of volcanologists as adrenaline junkies, but also to the whole issues of the media, because the event was sent out over from the Antarctic Scott Base as a little Associated Press report that this had happened. You know, 6 of us were down in there, but everyone was fine. And, you know, and then my parents saw that in the newspaper. But people in the group started collecting accounts from around the world. And what we saw was that from this known little short few sentence thing that was actually quite accurate and very understated, the media coverage of this expanded. And unfortunately, I don't have the copies here with me, but there was one I particularly like that Colin Monteith had a friend send him from, I can't remember, somewhere in Australia. And it was this graphic description of us with pools of lava around us, and it had quotations from us about the event. So that was a quick wake-up call that you can't believe everything you read in the paper, and also that there are challenges to communicating events, particularly sort of snazzy events like volcanic eruptions, to the media, even if you don't try to communicate them. Little did I know at the time that my next job, my next station would be at Mount St Helens, which of course erupted, big eruption on May 18th, 1980. At the time, I was working on the east coast of the US for the US Geological Survey, doing marine geophysics, but then I started whining and begging and pleading to get out to where the active volcano was. So I had the offer to transfer to Mount St Helens to play the role of public information scientist. At the time, I had no experience of working with the media other than that sort of secondhand experience at Mount Erebus. But my boss at Woods Hole said, look, you've been wanting to get out there. You know, it's a way to get your foot in the door, just go do it. So I arrived in late 1980, which was at a time that the volcano was changing from explosive activity to dome building activity. So there was a lot of uncertainty about what exactly the volcano was doing. So I said I had no media experience, and I was plunked down in front of the not only the TV cameras, but it was an interesting time. Of course, this was back before the internet. I know it's hard to believe there was a time before the internet, but back in those days, everything was on the telephone. And every day, I would get a call from the wire services, from some regular radio folks, local radio folks, from some local newspaper folks, and they would want a daily update. And then if anything was happening, they would move in with the microphones and the cameras to do interviews. So at that point, I was really confronted with the challenge of communicating science. And as you heard this morning, that's something that AXA is also quite interested in. And in particular, I realized the challenges of communicating what we live with every day, which is probabilities and uncertainties. And at the time of Mount St. Helens, what I discovered is because I couldn't say that the volcano was going to erupt at noon on Tuesday, either I was working for the government and therefore I was hiding something, or I didn't know what I was talking about. And those are sort of the end members, and that's a theme that I think you'll see in some of the papers and that we'll discuss. However, I did discover in my time there that with the media folks I worked with every day, particularly the newspapers, but also some of the other media who actually got trained, they got more and more knowledgeable about volcanology and volcanic activity. They learned to trust me more, and communication improved. So that it is workable. I think Steve has found the same thing at Montserrat. But it takes time, and that's another important message, is you can't just tell the media something and expect them to take it at face value and go from there. Most of my career has then been in more academic volcanology at the University of Oregon, but I did spend some time at Montserrat with the Scientific Advisory Committee, and this guy you'll be seeing more of this afternoon if you don't know him already, Willie Aspinall, and Sue Laughlin, who's now with the BGS. And this was another sort of formative time for me because I think at this point, since I was further on in my career, sort of felt I understood volcanoes. It was quite humbling to get to Montserrat and realize that actually we still have, there's a huge amount that we don't know about how volcanoes work, and that what we don't know becomes important when people are trying to deal with a situation, particularly like the one at Montserrat, where they have a volcano that's been erupting since 1995. So that, to me, just was more motivation for us as volcanologists to get better at understanding how volcanoes work. I also just wanted to say a few notes. Another sidelight that I've been interested in is volcanoes, not just in society, but in human history. And I think volcanoes have played a special role in the cultures where they exist, partly because they form very impressive landscape features, so people know about them. From the point of view of anthropology and archaeology, the volcanic deposits themselves often preserve cultural artifacts, and the classic example of that is Pompeii. A lot of what we know about Roman culture is because of the cities, Pompeii and Herculaneum, that were preserved by the 79 AD eruption of Vesuvius. I think we need to look back in human history, and this is something that will come out this afternoon, because, of course, volcanic eruptions typically have very long repose intervals. We have enough trouble in modern society communicating hazard and risk, and I think it's a very interesting question to look back and say, were there ways that past societies actually did that, and how successful were they? And again, I come back to this observation that people have made now that there's been a couple of decades of trying intensely to educate specific groups about volcanic risk, is that the studies still find that local populations, whether it's in Hawaii or in Oregon, places I know, that knowledge is still fairly poor. Where it's good, people then have handed over obligations to authorities and just say, you know, oh yeah, I know that this is a problem, but I'm not going to deal with it. And that politicians or governments, for the most part, haven't been very good at dealing with these long-term risks because there are so many short-term demands. And so that if you're looking at trying to plan on pre-disaster planning for things like volcanic eruptions, or another big thing in my part of the world in the Northwest US is large subduction zone earthquakes. It's actually quite difficult to get people to do things ahead of time because it's often very expensive and there are a lot more immediate short-term needs. And then one other issue that we've seen in volcanic eruptions around the world, but also climate events, and I'm thinking particularly of another event from my country, Hurricane Katrina, is that in that case, even the physical response was not good immediately. Took quite a bit of time to get people's physical need taken care of. But something that we're really lacking in many societies is then dealing with psychological recovery after events, which usually takes quite a bit longer, particularly for these big natural disasters that people don't understand. So that I've been interested in various, in communicating with anthropologists and historians to look back in time and say again, how did past societies cope with this? So that's a little bit of background of my interests and how I got into this. As I said, I decided that today I didn't want to talk at you. Instead, I wanted to encourage you to talk with each other. And I chose 4 papers specifically about different volcanic crises, I guess we could call them, that span from the 1970s up till the recent event in Iceland. And I've chosen papers where people have tried to provide some sort of retrospective analysis of what happened during the event. And then one of the papers, as you saw, was more a response from volcanologists to looking at what had happened and trying to dissect and set up protocols for the role of scientists during events.